So I'm watching Joe Rogan the other day, and he's interviewing Stephen Meyer, who, if you don't know, he's a very prominent scientist, but he's also a Christian. He's a big proponent of the intelligent design movement. And they're having this amazing conversation. It's really good. And after they wade through a lot of the scientific stuff, Joe Rogan asks Stephen about his personal experiences with God. And you could tell that Stephen's a little uncomfortable because he's a scientist and he kind of wants to stick to the topic at hand. But he ends up telling Joe about some personal experiences. He tells him about how on several occasions he has felt what he described as an inaudible voice that was kind of injected into his thoughts that he knew wasn't his, and this was God's voice guiding him. And Joe Rogan, in kind of typical fashion, starts to question this. And he starts to say things like, well, listen, I know you believe that that's, from God, but there have been other people who have believed that they've had experiences from God, but they were high or they were mistaken or they were, all those kinds of things. And it got me thinking and reminded me about a conversation I had heard with William Lane Craig about the testimony of the Holy Spirit and whether or not that can be used as a solid basis for knowing that God is real. I'll link that podcast down in the description below, but the principle at work here is something like this. The mere presence of counterfeits doesn't negate the genuineness of the real thing. Again, the mere presence of counterfeits doesn't negate the genuineness of the real thing. William Lane Craig gives an example of this, and he says, imagine there are several bottles of clear liquid, all right? One of the bottles of clear liquid is H2O, and somebody comes along and they put a label on it, and it says H2O. So you got the actual water in the bottle, and then it labeled with H2O. But then the other bottles of clear liquid, they're actually poison inside. And yet someone comes along and labels those H2O as well. Now, the question is this. Does the mere presence of mislabeled bottles of H2O, right, the poison bottles, does that do anything to negate the fact that in this bottle, it really is H2O? It really is water? Well, of course not, right? And it doesn't matter how many more counterfeit bottles you would make or mislabels you would make, it wouldn't change the fact that in this bottle, there is genuine H2O. And we could think of many examples of this in other terms as well. So what about a memory you have, right? So for example, I remember distinctly going to Israel a number of years ago for my best friend's wedding. So I've got that memory in my head. I can remember going to Jerusalem. I remember seeing the wall. I remember going through tunnels and all kinds of amazing things, right? It's all up here. I know that I went there. But what if somebody came up to me and said then, well, there's a lot of people who thought they remembered certain things. They thought they experienced certain things, and then they realized they were wrong or they were delusional or those memories couldn't be trusted. Okay. Well, should that make me doubt that my memory is real? Well, of course not, right? All that tells me is that, yeah, there are some people that have some misguided memories. But that does nothing to try and convince me that my memory is misguided. I shouldn't start doubting my memory and my experience and what I know to be real simply because there are counterfeits out there. The same could be said about our experiences with God. I mean, you could expand this to religion in general, right? Just because there are people who genuinely believe in a certain God and turns out that they're misguided or they are wrong, does nothing to show that the God of the Bible is false, right? That doesn't logically follow. And yet this seems to be a trap. This seems to be a suggestion that many people try to pose to the Christian. Hey, there were other people that believed in gods and they were wrong. Okay. There were other people who thought they had experiences with God, but turns out they were wrong. Okay. No, in order for me to be convinced that my experience with God is somehow counterfeit, you have to demonstrate that about my specific experience. Similarly, just because there are counterfeits out there when it comes to religions, that does nothing to make me doubt the veracity of my own. You need to demonstrate with facts and evidence that the God of the Bible is false. So my friends, don't fall for this. It seems palatable at first. It seems like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't But the reality is, just because there are counterfeits doesn't mean that the genuineness of the real thing should come into question.